My first release was in summer 1994, so it's 17 years now. Unbelievable. And before that I played in a band at school and made music for like off-theater groups and stuff like that, but nothing which I would consider as important these days. And I'm actually very happy that my school band times were before the internet. So everything I did there is lost forever.
No evidence.
No evidence, no. I'm not a trained musician at all. I have no formal musical education apart from what I acquired much later when I felt that actually I need more skills. I come from a very technical background. Pretty much everyone in our family was engineers, and it was clear that I'd become an engineer too. And things started to become interesting when I realized that engineering and art can do something together or have something in common, or there's overlaps, and that's pretty much when you start thinking about sound engineering or electronic music or also any kind of digital media arts. But this of course was in the mid-80s not the most common focus. But electronic music certainly was. The only software was a Commodore computer which ran occasionally a basic sequencer, but all the sound generation was hardware. And so for me, hardware till a very long time was the predominant parts of my studio, and the transition from hardware to almost entirely doing things in software was a quite slow transition, and I only became fully software-based something like maybe 2 years ago. And I still have all my old synthesizers. They are just lying around here somewhere in the and occasionally I connect them again to use them for specific sounds. Well, I guess it's very obvious that for sequencing, of course, you want to have a computer, because for sequencing and for audio editing, it's so obvious that a computer is a fantastic tool. You don't want to cut tape if you have instead of a hard disk recording system. And the moment where really computers start to become interesting for me was when I discovered Macs, because Macs suddenly allowed me to create musical structure in a way which is much closer to my thinking than actually playing. For those who have not so much idea about Macs, you can do structures which involve repetition of structures, and structures which can change automatically. So you can say, I want to have 5 repetitions of this groove, and every repetition I want to add a random note to it. Or I want to repeat this groove 8 times, and each repetition I want to have it a little bit slower, or stuff like this. And you can build stuff which triggers other stuff and triggers other stuff and triggers other stuff. And this allows you to come up with very, very complex musical structures with actually very little bit of programming. And this I found highly interesting. And yeah, so this was the moment when I thought, okay, computers are really powerful. But at this time, I'm talking about the mid-90s, I used computers only for creating structure, and the actual sound generation was all done in hardware. And then there was a big mixing desk, and everything had been recorded onto a DAT tape, and then came along a tedious editing process. And nowadays, basically everything is inside the computer, and so I'm still using Max MSP, but of course also Ableton Live massively for the obvious reasons. I have 2 main sound sources. The one sound source is recordings of almost every kind of sound I can find somewhere. So I'm working a lot more than in the earlier days with field recordings, which has to do with the fact that I have a nice little field recorder and good microphones. And I work with pretty much all kinds of synthesis which software can offer. And the only reason to go back to hardware synthesizers is really because I like the specific timbre of a specific synthesizer. I mean, I have the great luxury to own a few machines which are very unique in their character, and Sometimes I just feel that I like to have this specific color. However, that's nothing which is necessary for music making. It's just happening that I have access to this and that I like the specific sound. But if someone asks me, do I need hardware to make music these days, I would clearly say no. There's absolutely no reason for having hardware anymore. It's much more an emotional debate than anything else. If you really want to have an analog sound and you have just a normal sound card with more than 2 outputs, route the output to the input and go back in, and then you have your analog processing. Buy a cheap second-hand Behringer mixing desk and integrate it in the loop and you have analog. If you really believe it makes such a difference, go for it and do it and experiment with it. It's certainly a nice experience, but for me, the essence of music is somewhere else. I totally agree that some of my old analog synthesizers sound very different from what I have in software. But I cannot say they sound better or worse, just different. And I have been using this stuff on numerous records, and so actually if my new records sound different because I'm not using those tools anymore, even better. I think I created every possible sound I can come up with from a Juno 6. I don't need to have this sound again, you know? Yeah. In the very early days, there was not so much a difference between playing live and recording, because even our studio work was actually jamming and editing the jams. And this of course changed over the years. Now I'm much more into constructing things. So I think I much more go to composition rather than jamming. And the only thing I really still jam is specific gestures or movements. But for creating gestures, I need hardware. But the hardware doesn't need to have a sound generator. So what I'm using these days is fader boxes and other means of hardware control. But the actual sound generation is happening in software. And this is what I'm using on stage too, because on stage, of course, I want to perform, I want to be able to interact, and having just a mouse wouldn't be sufficient for what I want to do. I have very specific ideas of what I want to do. And I also have this engineering background, and this brings me in a quite tricky position from time to time. And this is the position of someone who just can do things. And that can be quite a challenge. But as far as the Monolake 2 is concerned, I just felt that I want to be able to control my live sets without using the mouse. And then I thought, what does it actually mean? And I wrote down a few ideas, what it could mean, and I came up with the conclusion, yeah, I can do this, I can build something like that. And there was one very essential part which I wanted to be able to control without the mouse, and this is triggering clips in live to create structure. And at this point in time, 6 years ago, there was absolutely no way to achieve this. But since I'm with the company, I had access to this tiny little loophole there called the Python API, which allows me to actually get the clip information out of live and into my machine. And only due to this little backdoor into the software, I was able to realize the Monolake and to actually use it for what I wanted to use it for. I mean, nowadays these functions are public with the Max API, but at this time it was a pretty unique thing to have. And I didn't expect that building the Monolake takes so much time. I was estimating 3 months, and I was estimating maybe 2 months for building a live set, which makes sense of all the functions. And as a matter of fact, I think the hardware took me 6 or 7 or 8 months, and creating a live set which is satisfying took me half a year. Now it was a very different situation from what I expected. On the other side, I have to say that the performance I did with the Monolake justified the effort. I had a few performances which I could absolutely not imagine doing with anything else. And I just now, like today, last week, started considering giving up on using the Monolake and going a step further. Because now I feel after 6 years that I'm really reaching the limits of what I can do, and that I feel the structures I want to present in a live concert situation cannot be represented by a fixed hardware anymore. And so my current approach is actually really investigating into Touch OSC on iPads and building interfaces which are modular. Because this is the one aspect which on one side I liked on the Monolake, that it's fixed and that it forces me to think in a fixed structure. So here's the instrument, learn it, and if you think it's limited, well, then you are limited. So I punished myself by sticking to the knobs and faders and things which are on there and said, use it. And if you think you can't make the music you want, then rethink your music.